and greetings once again. Welcome to our show, The Silence of Our Friends. The Silence of Our Friends. This episode is entitled Look Away, Look Away, Look Away, Look Away. And it's going to be very, very interesting. We air each Monday night at 6:30 on YouTube, and we appreciate your support. We appreciate you subscribing to the YouTube channel and also pressing the notification icon so that you are indicated and notified each time we release a podcast. We appreciate your support so very, very much. And welcome to any of our new listeners. We appreciate you, and we would appreciate your support in terms of helping us to grow this particular channel as well. Look away, look away, look away, look away. I read something earlier this past week that gave a lot of credence, I think, that will help us to explain our position in terms of being black Africans still in America, awaiting our fair treatment, awaiting our justice. And these United States are not united quite yet. I call it the United States yet to be united. This statement made a lot of sense to me, and it simply read, I made some adjustments to it. Black people in America, people resisting, people demonstrating, so forth and so on, is not the notion of black people against white people. My reason for being here tonight is not black against white, rather black people against racism. So I'm a black man in America, and I'm against racism, and racism in any form. And our show is entitled The Silence of Our Friends because silence takes on many forms, and I think that many people have been silent as far as racism is concerned, particularly the church in America, because either one of two measures are applicable. One, people are not aware of what racism actually is, what it looks like, how it is defined, the reaches of racism, the touches, so forth and so on. Or secondly, perhaps it's such a white herring, no pun intended, perhaps pun intended a bit. It's such the red elephant in the room that no one wants to deal with. It's such a magnanimous, such an egregious wrong that has happened in many countries, but particularly the United States, yet to be united. And so Dr. King made a statement that has been characterized as a quotation now, and we use it here at the Silence of Our Friends. In the end, he says, what will be remembered will not be the words of our enemies, but the silence of our friends. I thought I would define silence to give us perhaps a workable glossary definition for this word. Silence is the position of being at rest. So the question becomes, have we been at rest regarding racism in America? Being still, inactive or motionless, quiet, statue-like. That's going to be important. Hold on to that. I'm coming back for it later. Still, silence is characterized as holding one's breath. Have we been holding our breath as a nation, as people of color, waiting and hoping that someone else would do something about our particular plight in this country? Not stirring a step. Silence, not stirring a step, not moving to the left or to the right, but being motionless in some position. It also is characterized as being at a standstill. In America, racism, as far as a subject and as far as people effectively dealing with it, has been at a standstill for at least the last 50 years. Immobility, inactivity. And Dr. King also said at some point, silence becomes betrayal. silence becomes betrayal. I heard someone else make the statement, and I'm not sure who the author of this one is. Silence is violence. Silence is violence. I thought about this earlier last week, and it came to me that even in the life of Jesus, our icon from the scripture, the biblical iconic Jesus, had friends who apparently were silent. They were silent at his trial. They were silent at his conviction. They were silent during his arrest. Even Simon Peter was silent at his arrest. And there, the friends' silences cost Jesus his life. Of course, we're glad that he died because he paid the price and the ransom for us who are believers for the sin debt acquired through Adam. However, the notion, I don't want us to lose the point that Jesus had done so much work for so many people, so many good things, and yet he died because his friends were silent. Some of our discussions may be initially distasteful to particular groups. That is not what I'm after, however. Let me use an analogy. Ignoring pain in your physical anatomy, pain in your body, ignoring the pain and hoping it will go away, or even coping with it, will not create a healing, will not create the desired relief. So ignoring racial and social issues don't make them go away. Social ills in our world, as well as anything happening in your physical body, must be addressed. Here's something that's very interesting. I like to start the show with some interesting current events, or what I believe to be of interest, and hopefully it's of interest to you. Number one ranked University of Alabama football team coach Nick Saban in this past week. Now, the number one ranking depends on with whom you speak, and I'll just leave it at that. But this football team coach, who has been heralded as almost a savior of sorts, 6, I believe, national championships for the University of Alabama, has been recently tormented in blogs and comments on the World Wide Web by racist white fans. Now, all the time, probably a good 70 to 80%, if not 90% of that team's composure is men of color, black men. And all the time they're winning, both the team is heralded and celebrated, as well as its illustrious coach. And he is a good coach. I will give them that. I'm not a fan of Alabama football. But this past week, he supported a commercial. He supported his team through a commercial, and he stated, "Black Lives Matter." He ends the commercial, and at least in the commercial, he makes the statement, and I quote, "In this moment in history, we cannot be silent." You might have been listening to my show, but let's just keep going. The commercial ends by saying, "All lives cannot matter until Black Lives Matter." And I say thumbs up, Coach Saban. I say thumbs up to the team, and I say thumbs up to the University of Alabama, normally of which I don't have a lot of positive comments to make. However, he's been being blitzed in the media by white racist fans who love the Alabama team. They loved Bear Bryant, Coach Bryant. They love the herringbone pattern. They love the crimson and the team colors, the crimson and gray. They love it. They love the mystique of the team. They love the city of Tuscaloosa, where the team is located. They love all the parts and components of Alabama football. But the moment the coach steps out of what to me is typically a racist background and makes a public statement unifying with his team and addressing the ills in our culture, the ills of our country, white racists everywhere, it comes out. As long as we're playing football, and as long as these black players are making touchdowns, and as long as the team has high rankings within the SEC and within the collegiate football ranks, everybody is happy. But when the coach, the once heralded coach, makes a statement of truth, it causes the hairs on the back of otherwise Confederates, and I'm getting to it in a minute, to be raised on the back of their Confederate necks. And that is, unfortunately, a mindset, a paradigm that sweeps this country, this melting pot called America. It goes so far as a mayor in the city of Carbon Hill, a city in Alabama, resigns after racist statements made. The mayor's name is Mark Chambers, and he makes this statement. I think it was on his Twitter account. He makes the statement, and I quote, "I got several Alabama pictures for sale." Now, you can tell by his diction, he's not the most intelligent man in the world, as most white racists are not, or any racist, because racism is ignorance. And I mean what I said. Any ethnic group that is racist is ignorant. Racism cannot hide unless it hides behind the cloak of ignorance. And this show exists to bring to light, to cast a light on what was once held as ignorance. And he goes on to say, "I got several Alabama pictures for sale. Nick Saban," he calls his name, and he spelled it incorrectly. The coach's name is spelled S-A-B-A-N, and I think he spelled it S-A-B-E-N. Ignorance again. And the Crimson Tide is, and he doesn't have subject-verb agreement, should be are, but is done, in my opinion. I'll post them tomorrow, end quote. Racism. It follows every news line. And as we addressed last week, the church is not exempt. We had a white pastor with an interracial church in Atlanta, Georgia. I will try not to call his name tonight. Another white pastor with a large interracial congregation in Ohio, very well known. Another white pastor in Birmingham, Alabama, with the largest church in the state. Racism has come out of their actions and statements, and they've tried to clean it up, to go back and make recorded statements. And I said last week, and I want to say it again, I want people to get it and understand it. It's not so much to these white pastors by their actions that Black Lives Matter, the reason being for them cleaning up their act and cleaning up many of their statements, but black tithes matter. They can count very well. And so it's racism by another name. I'm going to get to that in a minute. I need to move on. I had a story posted by one of my Facebook friends, and I don't get a chance, an opportunity to read a lot of Facebook. We have several Facebook accounts and have interaction on many of the socials. But the thing with me was I had an opportunity to see this particular article, and it was by one of my Facebook friends. And actually, the couple are people for whom I have a great deal of respect as people in the things of God, as what I believe to be good-hearted people. However, when certain storylines come up, black people being exalted and things that have held black people in limited and diminutive situations come to bear, then it all of a sudden, just like this article and this television commercial with Coach Nick Saban, is a revealer. It's an identifier. It's a magnifier of what people truly think and who they are at heart. Some of it is ignorance. What is it? Dr. King makes the statement, there's nothing in the world as dangerous as sincere ignorance and conscientious stupidity. The one sincerely ignorant person who just doesn't know and holds their ground, but it's founded in a lack of knowledge. The other person is still ignorance, but the other person is conscientiously stupid. They think through, they analyze, they are able to articulate it, they are able to understand it, they're able to critically analyze it, but at the end of the analytics, they still come with the idea of something that is stupid, and racism is stupid. Race itself is stupid. And so this particular post on Facebook by one of my Facebook friends, I thought to unfriend them. It was so offensive to me. But I experienced not necessarily racism or bigotry, but I experienced separatism from some people that I grew up knowing, respecting, but because God had another direction and intention on my life, I had to go a different route. Just say that. And upon going that different route, I experienced some negative behavior, which I don't think the people intended to be negative necessarily, but it came out that way. And at the end of the game, the end game was, the Lord said to me, he said, George, they don't understand. They don't understand. He said, and so you must walk in love and display my character until these people understand that I've called you to do X, Y, and Z. And I did that. My wife and I did that, and it has worked out well. But it took about a good 20 years for that to happen. So that's not necessarily racism or injustice or bigotry. Perhaps it's injustice. Perhaps it's just the sincere ignorance of people. They don't, by them not understanding, they still come to the place that there's an ignorance of something. And all of us are ignorant of something or things. And the Lord said to me, he said, I need you to have the same mindset with this particular person. Don't unfriend them. But as you are doing your shows and as you are addressing issues that I'll place on your heart, walk in love. And this person made the statement, and I'm that Confederate statues, they didn't see the difference between Confederate statues and civil rights heroes statues being in parks in various cities across these yet to be United States. And I take issue with that. So tonight we're dealing with mindsets, paradigms, and behavior. So behavior comes as a result of certain paradigms in thinking, certain set thought processes. Yes. The question becomes, where does racism and injustice, bigotry, so forth and so on, from whence does it originate? Where does it come? It is learned. We do know that it is not at all an inherent quality of mind. Children are not born racist. They're not born bigots. There's not this I view of black versus white, if I can just keep it simple, or white versus Native American, or white versus Latino, or Mexican, or Hispanic, or any other Asian, or any other ethnicity. I'd like to just read for you the third stanza of the Star-Spangled Banner. The one that begins, "Oh, say, can you see by the dawn's early light?" Sang at every sporting event, every public assembly of people of America, and it is the anthem of the Americas. And it starts out pretty well. "Oh, say, can you see by the dawn's early light, why so proudly we hailed at the twilight's last gleaming, whose broad stripes and bright stars through the perilous fight o'er the ramparts we'd watched were so gallantly streaming, and the rocket's red glare, the bombs bursting in air, gave proof through the night that our flag was still there. Oh, say does that star-spangled banner," referring to the flag, "yet wave over the land of the free and the home of the brave." But when you get to the third stanza, it's very interesting. "And where is that band who so vauntingly swore that the havoc of war and the battle's confusion, a home and a country, should leave us no more? Their blood has washed out their foul footsteps' pollution. No refuge could save the hireling and the slave. This song was about preserving slavery in America. So the Star Spangled Banner, the national anthem of our country, was not about people of color. So when we attempt to answer this question, from whence does racism come and how is it congealed in the hearts of people as it is learned? If it is learned, then the reciprocal of learning is teaching, which means that somebody taught it, which means that the whole setup of the Americas was not inclusive of the classic definition of the word our, O-U-R. We talked about in show 1 in St. Matthew chapter 6, racism could never have existed if people weren't so ignorant as to understand the word our, spoken by Jesus when he taught his disciples to pray. He said, after this manner, therefore, pray ye, our Father who art in heaven. He is the Father of everyone, every ethnicity. And there could have been no way that slavery could have been justified had people understood the classic meaning, the most basic meaning of the word our. And in this context, I'm saying that when the word our is used here in the Americas, yet to be United States, that our does not include, or did not originally include, people of color. As you will note, they were slaves at the time. And the mindset was to keep them enslaved. You think about it. Just say this. You're a slave owner, all right? And you own 100 slaves on your plantation. And they've been working for you. You purchased them. And let's say you had a cash outlay for the 100 slaves that you had on your huge plantation. Your cash outlay in terms of purchasing your slaves as chattel, was about, let's just say you spent $1,000 for 100 slaves. All right. Even if you spent $10,000 for 100 slaves, you have an investment. Now all the cotton or tobacco they're picking, they are require very minimal living conditions. You have them in shacks. They don't have beds. They don't have accommodations. They sleep on the floor. Everything is rickety about their conditions. You feed them only the food that you have left over from your desirable meals. Their clothes are tattered and torn. You do nothing for their maintenance and upkeep, and you work them from can't to can't, as the old slave said, can't see to can't see. And now, after 1865, the Emancipation Proclamation is signed. The Civil War has been lost by the South, thank God. And you're without slaves. You're ticked off because you've had 100% profit on everything you sold, everything you harvested from the land. Everything made you wealthy. And there's so much I could say right there. But now all of a sudden your slaves have been freed by the Emancipation Proclamation signed by then President Abraham Lincoln. Now you're ticked. So what does this country of ours do? They find a way to enslave the black in America all over again. Slavery by another name was prison camps. Prison camps. So I'm just talking through this because our, in its classic sense, did not include blacks in America. And this mindset has been perpetuated, of which no one wants to deal, including the church, including church leaders, because it is not profitable, nor is it popular, and it can get you hurt as far as your reputation is concerned. And so people don't deal with it. You don't want to offend white people, but the truth is still the truth. And as far as I can read, it is only the truth that makes men free. Known truth. You shall know the truth, not subjective truth to your own experiences or understanding, but the truth about a thing within a matter within itself. The truth, historical truth, and the truth that you know makes men free. And so allow me to finish. No refuge could save the hireling and slave from the terror of flight or the gloom of the grave. Nothing can save the slave. In other words, this country was founded on this kind of mindset. And the Star-Spangled Banner in triumph doth wave over slavery and its ugliness and heinousness, or the land of the free and the home of the brave. But our show is entitled tonight, Look Away, Look Away, Look Away, Look Away. And that is the chorus of this song, Dixieland, better known to as Dixie. And I believe that refers to south of the Mason-Dixie line, the split, the diagonal split between the North and the South. And we'll get to that in one moment's time. I wish I was in the land of cotton. You know, this had nothing to do with people of color. They were not, people of color couldn't wait to get away from cotton. But the sad truth about it was black slaves in America were freed with no tools, no land, no money, nothing. So where do black people go? So that introduced the idea of sharecropping, which was slavery by another name. The plantation owners still owned the land, and then the sharecroppers were paid to work off the land, and they lived there as well and were paid pennies, just a small stipend. Most of the time it wasn't enough for them to even live and for their families to live. Slavery by another name. And so I wish I was in the land of cotton. Old times there are not forgotten. Old times like make America great again. And the only time America was great in these white racist mindset is when slaves were building it and plantation owners and the rich were observing them and tantalizing them, if you will. And here's the chorus. Look away, look away, look away to Dixieland. Amazing. This is the anthem of the Confederate Army, which fought against the Union Army from the North. To the idea of the Confederate Army was to preserve slavery. The idea of the North or the Union Army was to free the slaves. That's what the heat of the Confederate War was all about. It was called the North versus the South, the Confederate Army versus the Union Army, the Civil War, the war between the states. Several names for the same war, but at the heel, the seat of it, of the battle, was this issue of slavery, which was an economic issue. And then the second stanza, in Dixieland where I was born early on one frosty morn, look away, look away, look away to Dixieland. I believe the mindset of the person who penned this anthem could have been several things, and it's been argued by persons more intelligent than me for a very long period of time. But in my small assessment, it could have been look away from the battle for these Confederates, these Southerners, white racist Southerners. Look away from the battle and keep your focus on Dixieland, where everything is great for us. Keep fighting. Don't let the heat of the battle take you out of the mindset that will keep us fighting to win the war over slavery. But I think it serves a great purpose for us who are alive and well today. The mindset of this country and the mindset of a lot of people, racists, bigots, people who perpetuate injustice, is to keep you looking away from the real issues. This president, current administration, said last week that he believes that former Vice President Joe Biden will win this election and he will lose to him. But isn't that the same mindset? He's trying to create diversion. When you ask people to look away from something, it doesn't mean that the something of which you're asking them to look away from doesn't exist. It simply means you're asking them to lose focus, to be diverted, to have their attention diverted from something that could be classified as the main thing to a lesser thing. And I think in him making that statement, it is to dissuade voters from going to the polls and voting against him in the hopes that the race has already been won and concluded by Democratic soon-to-be nominee, nominee clearly now, former Vice President Joe Biden. But isn't that what happened in the last presidential election? Wasn't it that mindset that Hillary Clinton had won the popular vote and was popular by all of the polls, and some people decided there was no reason to go to the polls and vote because it was a foregone conclusion. Bernie Sanders' followers and constituents did not go to the poll and vote, the statistics show, and consequently, though she won the popular vote, man, the matter was that she was still defeated, and in the end, it was defeat by way of a paradigm, by defeat by way of a mindset, and I don't even want to bring up the college. In how it works, because it's a little confusing. I think it is designed to do exactly what happened in the last presidential election here in the United States. So we're not looking away anymore. Bottom line, we've got to get to what I heard in my mind last week. We have to get to the soil of the issue. You see, the soil of the issue, the soil is not the plant. It isn't the seed. It isn't the harvest. But it's the most important part. After you have the seed, it is sown into the soil. And the soil demonstrates and decides the condition and consequently its future harvest. On February 18th, 1861 in Montgomery, Alabama, a band playing Dixie, quote unquote, headed the long procession escorting President-elect Jefferson Davis, remember that name, on his way to take the oath of office at the state capitol. Colonel John W. Enzer, a representative of the secession, keep that word in mind, secession. The secession convention in Alabama remembered that when he entered Montgomery, he noticed, quote, the strong, quick, elastic steps of all persons, the stern and determined countenances of men. Added to this were an unusual number of shrill whistles on trains and boats approaching and leaving the city, and the soul-stirring music of the calliops on streamers playing Dixie and other Southern airs. The song was soon recognized as the Confederate Army's mainstay. Now stay with me. Stay with me. During the Sterling Price's Missouri campaign of 1861, now remember the slaves were freed in 1865. In 1861, when the Confederate Calais Guards marched into Fayette, Arkansas, they were greeted with hot coffee and baskets of food provided by the Southern symphonizing ladies of the town. Guardsman John P. Bell remarked, quote, that we did justice to the good lady's bounty, and after eating and drinking our fill, our quartet of singers gave their rendition of Dixie. Now Dixie, also known as Dixieland, or I Wish I Was in Dixie, and other titles, was a popular song during the Civil War. Throughout the 20th century, it is one of the most distinctly Southern musical, stay with me, I'm going somewhere, I'm building my case, give me a moment, Southern musical products of the 19th century, and probably the best known song to have come out of that era. It was not at its creation a song that was intended necessarily to be the anthem of the Civil War, but it has since entered into American folk vernacular. The song likely cemented the word, you have to get there now, Dixie, in the American vocabulary as a nickname for the southern part of the United States. Now, this becomes very important when we are attempting to answer from whence does all of these mindsets and tenets of racism originate. The last challenge as to the writer of the song was made on the behalf of certain others, which may have collaborated that this person by the name of Emmett wrote Dixie. Now, Dixie originated in the minstrel shows of the 1850s and quickly became popular throughout the United States. So again, now new versions appeared at this time that explicitly tied the song to the events of the Civil War. The song, let's hold off on that. Minstrel shows, what were they? Those were white actors who acted and did these particular shows, musicals combined with acting, and they were called minstrel shows of that era in blackface. That's right. They painted their faces black to appear to be people of color. It's embarrassing to even talk about it, but the history of it is still true. And Dixie was one of those motivational songs that was used during this time era, and it coalesced with minstrel shows, both of which are disgusting and very distasteful in my view. Now, ironically, the song was a favorite of former President Lincoln. That's right, Abraham Lincoln, who signed the Emancipation Proclamation based on my research. He had it played at some of his political rallies, and then he had it played at the announcement of the surrender of the Confederate Army. Now, Dixie was played at Dan Emmett's funeral. Dan Emmett was alleged to be the writer, although there's some discrepancy about who actually penned the verses, but he is largely credited as writing the song in 1904 at his funeral. Now here, his tombstone, the inscription on his tombstone reads, "To the memory of Daniel Decatur Emmerich, 1815 through 1904, whose song Dixieland inspired the courage and devotion of the Southern people and now thrills the hearts of a nation." Where are people of color in that? Now, it's interesting to note, and I don't have it in my notes, but it's interesting to note that Daniel Emmett, allegedly the writer of the song, or credited as being the writer of this song, Dixieland or Dixie, died almost penniless. He lived the last 5 years or so of his life on a $5 stipend from the New York Actors Guild from when he did these minstrel shows. And he appealed to the people of the southern states of the Confederate to support him because he was in dire straits. He died a short while later. I just want to hold that thought because there's, to me, a parallel. You have to pay attention to people that God doesn't help. You have to pay attention to that. Why, if this song was so acceptable to God, and why, if it was so palatable and should have been soothed into the consciousness of both black and white alike, why did the man die penniless with a song that is still reverberating and gaining traction here in the Americas? Let me tell you a story. I am not an Alabamian. I'm a native Floridian. I grew up in the town, the nation's second largest city, or at least in that ranking, it was Jacksonville, Florida. Attended school at the University of Florida, in Gainesville, Florida. Now, Jacksonville is named after a Confederate, Jacksonville. We're going to get back to that. Hold that thought. And after coming here, I was called, well, before coming here, I live in a place I promised my wife we would never live because I grew up watching the film footage of the racial turbulence in the 60s and Bull Connor and his dogs, the fire hoses being turned on school students. And I knew this, even though the civil rights movement had its birth in Birmingham, Alabama, for the most part. at least its movements, if not birthed in Montgomery, but in the state of Alabama at least. I knew the vestiges of Jim Crowism and all of the injustices of the South, the white South. I knew that would not be a good place to raise a family. Long story short, I was convinced and further believed it was the will of God for my life to move here. We moved here. And then, if I can fast forward, in building ministry, I was led to start a ministry. In the start of the ministry, we started in a hotel room. 3 years later, we were building an almost $2 million building, the first of several building projects. And I'm thankful, very thankful to be used of the Lord in terms of my belief. I'm a believer, and I believe in the one God, the God of heaven, the God of the Bible. That's my belief. Now, I will not try to impose that upon you. That's my belief, and that's central to this particular story. In building that building, one day I would go every day and watch the progression of the building. One day I arrive on the premises, this ministry that has grown very quickly. I have not been to school to be trained to be an architect, so we had an architect assigned. We paid him over $300,000 to both supervise the project, draw the plans for the project, and make sure all of the permits and everything were in place. Again, that was my very first building project of that kind of size. One day I arrived to just investigate what's happening, and I walk through the building. The walls are up, the roof is on, and they're working inside, and many of the several subcontractors are there. There are probably 50 people working on this particular job. I walk in, I noticed outside, I don't know if I had been blind to it. I don't know if I had been looking away by just not paying attention to my surroundings, or if this particular day it just was so glaring. I looked at all the trucks, and they were four-wheel drive trucks, and they had Confederate flags on the front, rifles in the back, Confederate flags. I saw streaming in their back windows. I saw truck bed covers that had Confederate flags, and I said, wow. I walk in there, I see Confederate regalia, Confederate T-shirts. I see Confederate headbands. It's crazy. So I walked back out to my car, and at that time, the cellular telephones were attached. Mine was attached to my car. So I called the architect, and long story shorter, I say to him, sir, we have a challenge. He said, well, doctor, what's going on? I explained to him, and he said, what would you like me to do? I said, well, either you can come out here and talk to the general contractor about my problem. The problem being there are, I don't know if it was Confederate Day, I don't know if it was Confederate Memorial Day, I don't know what I had happened into. And again, this was in Birmingham or Bessemer, Alabama, a sub outlet of Birmingham, Alabama. So I don't know if I was in a hotbed, I don't know. And so I told him, I am not an ignorant black man. He said, well, I don't think you are, sir. I said, well, I want you to know, and I want you to be able to communicate that, in that specifically, I understand that the Confederate War was about freeing versus not freeing the slaves, of which probably my ancestors were on someone's plantation. I said, and so this is a non-negotiable. He said, well, what would you like to have me do? I said, you can either come and tell the general contractor and have him adjust all of his subcontractors, or I can tell him. He said, give me 20 minutes, I'll be there. He came. He walked around, and he said, I see exactly what you're saying. Now, see, I could have looked away. I could have looked away and said, well, they're here, and they're getting the job done that we're paying them to do. But I said to them, and this was over 20 years ago, first building project, and we've built over 10 million now. And I said, I'm aware that they may have their mindsets based and steeped in ignorance. I said, however, the problem is that our congregation is largely comprised of people of color. And I said, I think it's inherent inherently wrong on every level for people of color. I said, I'm putting shoes on their children's feet and food on their tables. And probably my money is buying those rebel shirts they're wearing and the full regalia. I said, I'm not going to be a part of that. I said, this is how strongly how strong it is with me. He said, what would you like to do? I said, have them take off everything that is Confederate related and tell them they will not be allowed on these grounds again if they wear anything that's referring even remotely to the Civil War. A war of losers, whose flag is still being waved in some parts of America, representing the mindsets of defeated people who are attempting to secede from even the United States as they were. Okay, so that was resolved, but it was an issue. Could have looked away, but I chose not to. Confederate statues were built to further a white supremacist future. This is an article written in history.com, and I'll tell you the author's name at the very end of it. It's very, very important. Southern history doesn't hold up when you consider the timing of when the quote end quote beautiful statues, as President Trump called them, went up. Now, he called them, these are beautiful statues. And I'm quoting, most of the people who were involved in erecting the monuments were not necessarily erecting a monument to the past, said Jane Daly, an associate professor of history at the University of Chicago, but, and I continue the quote, but were rather erecting them toward a white supremacist future. So now we're talking about statues and monuments which represent a mindset. So where did all this racism come? Well, it was born when black slaves were brought to America and blacks were considered not even fully human. And it was continued through slavery and plantation ownership of slavery. It was continued through the Civil War. This mindset, was perpetuating. And even after the South lost, thank God, they built statues to remind black people, in my view, and others that the South will still rise again, that the mentality was still in place. You could take the statues down, but what do you do about this mentality? And this is why we cannot be silent, inactive, immobile. Going further, the most recent report across the country was published by the Southern Poverty Law Center last year, and this article was dated 2015, so that would have been 2014. Huge spikes in the construction twice during the 20th century. They had a chart, and during the 20th century, that means the 1900s, there were two distinct times. It was in the 1950s and the 1960s, and you know what was happening. So this means in the early 1900s, then again 1950s and 60s. So it's just shortly after the Civil War ended, statues started going up, monuments started going up. Then again in the 50s and the 60s, when the Civil Rights Movement was gaining traction. So this mentality behind statues and monuments of these Confederate rebels, they were rebels against even the quote-unquote American cause, were to remind black people and other free-thinking people, liberal-thinking people, that we're still here. The mentality is still around. Notice in the early 1900s, states were enacting Jim Crow laws to disenfranchise black Americans. In the middle part of the century, the Civil Rights Movement pushed back against that segregation, which is represented by the spikes in those particular monuments being erected. James Grossman, the executive director of the American Historical Association, says that the increase in statues and monuments was clearly meant, listen, clearly meant to send a message. He quotes, "These statues were meant to create legitimate garb for white supremacy." Grossman said, "Why would you put a statue of Robert E. Lee or Stonewall Jackson, Jacksonville, in 1948 in Baltimore as in Maryland?" He continues his quote, who erects a statue of a former Confederate generals on the very heels of fighting and winning a war for democracy? White writes daily, referencing the just ended World War II. People who want to send a message to black veterans. He quotes himself by saying, "The Supreme Court and the President of the United States." That's who. Statues and monuments are often seen as long-standing permanent fixtures, but such memorabilia take effort, planning, and politics to get placed, especially on government property. That's one of my issues. Tax dollars of black people, Latinos, Asians, otherwise Hispanics, Native Americans even, in America are paying for the upkeep and maintenance of these statues that are placed on public property. Notice this, in an interview with the NPR, Daley said it's impossible to separate symbols of the Confederacy from the values of white supremacy. He said they're interwoven, these Confederate statues and the values of white supremacy, KKK mindsets, so forth and so on. In comparing Robert E. Lee to Presidents George Washington and Thomas Jefferson on Tuesday of that article, President Trump doesn't seem to necessarily feel the same, he says. Daley pointed to an 1861 speech by Alexander Stephens, who would go on to become the vice president of the Confederacy. Quote, "Our new government's '(S) foundations are laid. Its cornerstones rest upon the great truth that the Negro is not equal to the white man." 1861. This is at the start of the Civil War. The Negro is not equal to the white man, Stevens said. That slavery, subordination to the superior race is God's natural and normal condition. That's a mindset. It's in churches, it's in church leaders, it's in political leaders, it's in the average normal run-of-the-mill person with whom you engage every day. If they're outside of the black race, it's a perpetual mindset that we can no longer be silent. We must address. To build Confederate statues, says Daley, in public spaces near government buildings and especially in front of courthouses was a power play, quote unquote, meant to intimidate those looking to come to the seat of justice or the seat of law. In other words, they strategically placed them in position so that people coming to look for justice will look up at these statues and understand no justice here for you because our, quote unquote, OUR does not include you in America. And it's perpetuated into homes, churches, places of employment, universities, institutions of higher learning. It's amazing, but it doesn't come out. It doesn't seethe until it's stoked. And right now we have someone in the White House who is stoking the fires of this same mentality that was born at the era of black slaves being brought into America. It has never justified itself. Like cancer in the body, human body will not without proper treatment, barring a miracle from the Lord our God. He goes on in this speech of 1861 by Alexander Stephens to make this statement, quote, I think it's important to understand that one of the meanings of these monuments when they were put up is to try to settle the meaning of war, of the war, referring to the the Civil War, Daly said, but also to shape the future by saying that elite Southern whites, hear this, are in control and are going to build monuments to themselves effectively. And those monuments will endure, and whatever is going on around them will not. They had the right mindset for the wrong reasons, and that doesn't make it right. The statutes and monuments will be here for generations because they represent a mindset. Confederate monuments are widely distributed across the southern United States. The distribution pattern, listen to this, follows the general political boundaries of the Confederacy. And I'm almost finished. I'll say this and I'll try to end. The more than 1,503 public monuments and memorials to the Confederacy, of the more than 1,503 public monuments and memorials to the Confederacy, more than 718 are monuments and statues placed in the in particular public areas. The Confederate mindset. Let's just wrap this up by saying this. This is the mindset of the Confederate. And I call this the reason for which the monuments were placed initially, simply put. With the removal of the statues and the monuments, we cannot be silent about the mentalities that yet exist beyond the monuments themselves. These same mentalities were responsible for the placement of them in the first place. There are prominent names of the Confederates. I just want you to be able to recognize some of these names and monuments when you hear towns and cities and schools and universities. Even the University of Alabama had to change one of its halls from a racist plantation owner that has existed since the 1800s. Prominent names of Confederates. Now, note, these are mostly placed in public tax-supported locations. Here's a list of 8 according to an article dated June 22nd, 2015 by Alex Johnson, a reporter for NBC News. According to the article, please hear this. This is important. I'm about to wrap it up. According to the article, each state, quote, end quote, can honor 2 of its own heroes with statues in the U.S. Capitol in Washington. There are 8 Confederate statues in the U.S. Capitol to date, representing the losers of the Confederate War, the Civil War, which was the South, which fought to protect the rights of slave owners to keep slaves. Jefferson Davis, anything with Jefferson, anything with Davis in the South, and along those lines of the Mason-Dixie, traveling up northward towards Virginia, represent him. Robert E. Lee, James Zachariah, Wade Hamilton III, Edmund Kirby Smith, Alexander Hamilton Stevens, Zebulon Bayard Vance, Joseph Wheeler. I'll just give you one glossary term tonight. One term. Confederate. Typical meaning of this word, typical meanings for this word are companion, associate, fellow member. So when you talked about the Confederate Army, the word Confederate by itself alone just represents a fellow member, compatriot, accomplice, etc. But when placed together with the word army, making it a proper noun, Confederate Army, these words represent the militant South's resistance against the North in the battle on American soil fought over the issue which was economic of slavery. It sometimes is referred to as the war between the states as well as the North versus the South, so forth and so on. Robert E. Lee was the principal general of the South who fought to keep their plantations of cotton and tobacco with black slaves in their bondage. The North, led principally by General Ulysses S., I think it was his middle initial, Grant, if my memory serves me correctly. The Union Army, which was the United States Army. So you had, they fought to preserve the Union of the United States as the South was desirous of secession from the U.S. altogether. So here's a little known fact. We feel so much of this being black in America, jogging while black, sitting at your home and being killed while black. This just happened. The events I'm referring to, passing off an alleged $20 counterfeit bill while black, and having a white officer with his hands in his pockets kneeling on your neck for nearly 8 minutes 46 seconds, nearly 9 minutes, sitting and falling asleep in a Wendy's drive-through and ending up not going home while black. I mean, we could just go on and on and on. Over 1,500 deaths in the last 5 years with law enforcement officers, white against black. There's so many names. I'm going to do a show exclusively on just the names of people who have been murdered while in custody, selling single cigarettes on the streets of New York. The first I Can't Breathe while black. It's just the myriad continues. What the root of this is a mindset that must be corrected. Well, the South, this racist mindset was born in the South with black slaves, so forth and so on, as I've described. Black slaves, a little known fact, were forced to fight alongside bigoted, racist whites representing the Confederate Army. It's crazy. I'm talking about over 100,000. And the number is unknown. Does anyone see a problem here besides me? The secession of states following the election of President Abraham Lincoln in 1860, several states decided to secede from the Union. The states are South Carolina, Mississippi, Florida, Louisiana, Alabama, Georgia, Texas, Virginia, North Carolina, Arkansas, and Tennessee. Later, Kentucky and Missouri, which made up 13. And if you look on the Confederate flag, you have the X, and on each leg of the X, you'll have 3 stars and 1 in the center. 3, 6, 9, 12, and the 1 in the center is 13. It represents these states that were attempting to secede from the Union. Friends, we can no longer be silent. And I want to end tonight by telling you, blacks have made significant contributions to American culture, American society. Do a study on the 100 and more black inventions that were created, if not patented and created, by blacks in America. And don't believe the hype of when people attempt to educate you or miseducate you or undereducate you on the worth of blacks in America. We're God's people. We are not. I do not believe in inferiority. Neither do I believe in superiority. All men were created by God to be equal. And until this happens, friends of mine, we can no longer be silent. Thank you for your time tonight, and I'll look to see you again on next Monday evening at 6:30. Please share our channel, and thank you for subscribing to our channel and helping us to build it and get the word out. Thank you again very much. We can no longer be silent.